The Great Struggle of 1840 resulted in triumph for the Whig Party. It secured the executive and majority in both houses of Congress, but freedom gained little by the change. The slave power still controlled the general government. The new administration soon became quite as obsequious as the one it had displaced. This is Henry Wilson's historical account of the election of 1840 in his comprehensive 3-volume history of slavery and the Civil War. This is Henry Wilson and the Civil War. As Henry Wilson for the first time gained true political power in the Massachusetts State House, the Whig Party dominated federal elections and won the presidency. As Wilson said, the Whigs' victory did little to push the needle towards freedom for the nation, instead maintaining the status quo, in part because the new president, Henry Harrison, died just 31 days into office, and his vice president, John Tyler, was very pro-slavery. While in the long run, 1840 wasn't a victory for the anti-slavery movement, it represented a turning point in the career of Wilson. Wilson obtained his first seat in the Massachusetts General Court. Being a young and newly elected member, he was assigned to a seat far in the back of the legislative chamber. Each corner of the chamber had a fireplace that gave the room little heat during the often chilly winter sessions. The chairs were long and wooden with no cushions, especially uncomfortable for the legislators in their heavy overcoats and bulky top hats. Noticing he was missing much of the dealings and debate oriented in the front of the chamber, Wilson approached a quiet old farmer and offered him $3 for his seat closer to the action. Luckily for Wilson, the man accepted, and Wilson joined in on the action. During Wilson's first few days in government, he garnered both praise and criticism for his persuasive and impassioned speeches. Archibald Lindsay, a Democratic representative, known for his own skilled speaking style, noted one of Wilson's speeches was so persuasive it nearly made him a Whig. In that same statement, Lindsay charged Wilson with being, quote, hypocritically inconsistent, end quote. For much of his time in the State House, Wilson retained a pro-business voting pattern while simultaneously campaigning on standing with the working man, a perfect image for the Whigs, often charged with being too pro-business and disconnected from the needs of the laborer. In his first term, Wilson spoke on repealing a law which forbade interracial marriage between whites and blacks, and his fiery speeches against slavery often garnered retaliation from the aristocratic party bosses. Wilson, being from a strong abolitionist district, pursued an anti-slavery agenda anyways. Following one particularly powerful anti-slavery speech in 1846, William Lloyd Garrison, the nation's leading abolitionist, noted that Wilson's speech was, quote, unquestionably the best anti-slavery speech that has ever been delivered in any legislative assembly in the country, end quote. As the time came around for re-election, a radical group of Democrats, known as the Locofocos, attacked Wilson for being an overly ambitious, power-hungry politician, a criticism that stuck with Wilson throughout his career. From this point on, Wilson's early career in the State House can get a little confusing, so before we get into the details, I just want to go over the timeline so you have a rough idea of what's going on. In 1840, Wilson was first elected to the General Court. In 1842, Wilson ran for the state Senate, but lost. In 1844, he ran again for the Senate. This time he won. But then, in 1846, he left the Senate and then ran again for the House and won again. Then, in 1848, he was elected back to the Senate, where he stayed for the next 7 years. So between 1840 to 1850, Wilson was in the State House for 8 of the 10 years. Since Wilson lost his bid for the 1842 Senate seat, for the 2 years he wasn't in government, he continued to engage himself in political affairs and stay active within the party, as well as working at his shoe business. Around this time, Wilson also obtained his first newspaper with a group of other young ambitious Whigs, an activity he continued to participate in throughout his career. 1844 came around, bringing the country back to a presidential election. In the years leading to 1844, a national debate was growing over whether or not the United States should annex Texas. For context, we need to go back a couple decades to 1821, the year in which Mexico gained its independence from Spain. Under the federal system created by the Mexican Revolutionary Constitution, Texas was designated as basically one big state. As any Texan can tell you, Texas is a huge place, and at this time its population was very sparse. So American settlers moved into the land, many bringing along slaves, despite it being abolished in Mexico since 1826.
My name is Sam W. Haynes. I teach at the University of Texas at Arlington. I'm a professor of history there, and I'm also the director of the Center for Greater Southwestern Studies. I teach 19th century US and the American Southwest.
What would you say is what drew people to Texas? What drew American settlers to Texas?
Land, in a word. I mean, some may have been slave owners, some may have wanted to become slave owners, but land primarily. Land was, you could acquire a league of land, a league and a labor of land, which is about 4,600 acres, at a time when, for about $100, and you would pay it in installments. And it's also important to remember that many American immigrants, we don't say enough about these people, I think, were coming illegally, were not coming at the behest of the Mexican government. But certainly land was obviously free if you were a squatter, but it was practically free if you had a head right that had been granted to you by an impresario like Stephen of Austin. Land in the United States, public domain, was going for about $1.25 an acre, had to be paid in specie, and this was an almost unbelievable bargain. And so the Mexican impresario program was an almost unbelievable bargain. So it's no surprise that that Americans, primarily from the lower South, begin to come in droves, starting in the early 1820s. And the irony of the whole settlement program was that Mexico had devised this program whereby land agents or impresarios would attract colonists to Mexico, but the terms were so generous and the program succeeded so far beyond its expectations that once it decided in 1830 to stop that immigration program, it found that it could not do so because all immigrants came, American immigrants anyway, there were some from Europe as well, but American immigrants came hoping to speculate in land, just as they had speculated in land in the United States. And so to simply close the door on immigration in 1830 would have meant that the number of people in Texas would not grow, and the demand for land would plummet. So it was really in the best interests of American immigrants into Mexico to ensure that more people came. So when Mexico passed a law, a rather draconian law, April 6th, 1830 law is the name that Texas historians give it. When that law was passed, ending American immigration, it was essentially meaningless. And in fact, I think all of the evidence suggests that American immigration into Texas accelerates after 1830. It doesn't drop off, it actually increases. And by the time of the Revolution in 1835, most American colonists had come into Texas illegally after 1830 rather than before 1830.
Over the next few years, tension began to rise between the settlers and the Mexican government, which was becoming increasingly discontent with the stirrings of rebellion rumored to be swirling around the Americans. The Mexican government sent troops to Mexico, culminating in a fiery reaction from the settlers, leading to the iconic battle at the Alamo and the Battle of San Jacinto, which secured Texas independence. So in 1836, there's now a new massive nation filled with American slaveholders bordering the U.S. For the years leading to 1844, after winning independence, the Texans were ironically pleading to be annexed, though this time by the United States.
Texas, after the War for Independence, becomes a separate nation, And for the better part of a decade, the Lone Star Republic is a new nation in the American Southwest, with hopes, at least on the part of some people in Texas, to become a permanent nation state, rivaling that of the United States. At least that was the thought of one of the Lone Star Republic's presidents, Mayor Lamar. And to go back to my earlier point about slavery and the Texas Revolution, I'm not convinced that the Texas Revolution was a war just about slavery or the expansion of the institution. But it's pretty clear after the rebellion is over that white Texans want to create a republic for white citizens. We see this in the Texas Constitution, which is written at the height of the rebellion in March, just shortly after the fall of the Alamo. In fact, the Texas Constitution is written in some haste, but the delegates to the convention make it very, very clear that the institution of slavery cannot be compromised or infringed upon in any way. The institution of slavery is not guaranteed in the US Constitution, but it most certainly was in the Texas Constitution. Free blacks were expelled, at least that's what the Constitution said. They had a hard time enforcing that during the Republic period. Indians and were not citizens. Free blacks were not citizens. Mexicans were granted citizenship, but somewhat reluctantly, I must say. And during the Republic period, this decade-long era, you see a process whereby slavery becomes more deeply entrenched, the rights of free blacks become compromised. Mexicans quickly find that that Texas, where many of them had lived for generations, it simply becomes untenable, and there is this gradual migration out of the Republic by Mexicans. Some flee into Louisiana, some flee below the Rio Grande. There are actually very few Mexican Texans left when Texas is annexed to the United States in 1845. And then, of course, perhaps most famously or infamously, Texas embarks on a really drastic expulsion removal program of many Native American tribes. And so thousands of Native Americans were expelled from Texas during the Republic period.
A split began to emerge whether or not the United States should annex Texas. Those in favor of annexation were mostly slaveholders who saw Texas as a great opportunity to expand slavery, while those against it were mostly abolitionists who of course rejected the notion of adding a new slave state to the Union, and feared that annexing Texas would just stir up a tension with Mexico, who still had never officially recognized Texas as independent. So back to the election of 1844. Earlier that year, Wilson had took a trip to D.C. to feel out the mood in the National Party and get a better gauge for how Massachusetts Whigs should handle the Texas question. Wilson and other Massachusetts Whigs were forcibly opposed to the annexation, as they believed it would only be an advancement for slavery, the same reason the slaveholders wanted it. Wilson and other young Whigs decided to support Henry Clay, the Whig Speaker of the House, on the condition he opposed the annexation, as Clay had continuously signaled that he was anti-Texas. The Whigs nominated Clay, but not long after nomination, he reneged on his opposition to the Texas question and began to speak ambiguously about what the nation should do. Clay found himself in a tough spot, risking losing a large faction of his support if he either supported or opposed annexation. As the election waned on, anti-Texas Whigs became disheartened by Clay, with many refusing to continue their support. So in 1844, Clay lost to Democrat James K. Polk, a strong supporter of annexation, imposing a major loss for both the Whigs and the anti-slavery cause. While nationally the Whigs failed, Wilson was elected to the Massachusetts Senate, where he continued his battle against annexation. He and other young Whigs traveled the state, arguing against recognizing Texas and speaking out against Congress. Upon Wilson's pressure, the Massachusetts State House passed a resolution which condemned Congress for attempting to annex Texas. Wilson pushed for a bill which would have made it illegal to return escaped slaves from the territory, but it ultimately failed to pass. Establishment Whigs stopped opposing annexation and for the most part became complacent to it. Young Whigs like Wilson continued their push forward, further deepening the divide in the Whig Party. The Whigs became split into two factions, Cotton versus Conscience. Cotton Whigs were mostly complacent to slavery and made up the establishment and aristocratic class, while the Conscience faction was made up of firm abolitionists like Wilson. The Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Committee sent Wilson to Washington to deliver a petition with 30,000 signatures rejecting annexation to Massachusetts Congressman and former President John Quincy Adams. While Adams was supportive of the young Whigs' efforts, the petition got stuck in committee, and on December 29, 1845, Texas became the 28th and largest state in the Union.
So when Texas becomes when the Republic of Texas becomes a state in the Union in 1845, it is, for all intents and purposes, a world for slaveholders and the enslaved. And so for that reason, it's going to become very, very controversial. The annexation of Texas is going to be very controversial because by the 1840s, the expansion of slavery had become the third rail of American politics. So Texas is annexed with great controversy in 1845 by the means of a joint resolution. There was a treaty to annex Texas. There is no chance, no likelihood at all, without going into the details, that the Senate is going to have enough votes for ratification. But a joint resolution, which only requires a simple majority of both houses, that is considered possible. That the so-called Brown resolution does pass, but by an extraordinarily slender margin. The vice president pro tem of the Senate is needed to break a tie. It is really one of the most divisive issues that Congress has tackled in its history up to that time.
In 1846, Wilson returned back to the lower house, where he increased his drive against slavery. Wilson proposed a resolution which read, quote, that Massachusetts distinctly and solemnly announce to the country her uncompromising opposition to the further extension and long existence of American slavery, that she hereby deliberately declare her earnest and unalterable purpose to use every lawful and constitutional measure for its overthrow and entire extinction, and she hereby pledges her cordial cooperation to the friends of civil liberty throughout the Union in every just and practical measure that shall tend to free our country from the domination, curse, and shame of slavery, and make her great and glorious among the nations. End quote. This statement garnered Wilson huge blowback from the Cotton Whigs. An anti-slavery statement like this was rarely openly expressed outside of what was then considered radical fringes. Wilson's opponents charged that this statement would cause a ruckus in the South and lead to a boycott of Massachusetts industry. While the resolution failed, Wilson held his ground against the attacks and made clear that this young group of conscience Whigs was all in on fighting the slave power. Around the same time the Conscience Whigs were formed, the Wilmot Proviso was introduced in Congress. The proviso introduced by David Wilmot was intended to prohibit slavery in all of the new territories acquired from Mexico. The young anti-slavery men like Wilson strongly supported the Wilmot Proviso. Wilson and his colleague, Charles Francis Adams, who happened to be the son of John Quincy Adams, felt that Conscience Whigs needed an outlet to express their views and counter the rigid Cotton faction which dominated every Whig outlet. Wilson and Adams saw the opportunity in the failing newspaper, the Daily Whig. The men gathered their friends and colleagues, S.C. Phillips, Charles Sumner, and John Palfrey, to discuss the venture. Both Wilson and Sumner had no funds to contribute to the purchase of the paper, but they both committed to dedicating their time to the project. With support from more influential abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison, the men purchased and began publishing the Daily Whig. The paper slated its mission as trying to unify the party and establish the narrative that they were the true Whigs, both contradicted by the paper's attacks on Cotton Whigs and the Whig Party leaders. As suspected by anti-Texas proponents, not even a year after Texas annexation, Democratic President Polk pushed towards a war with Mexico.
The southern boundary of Texas, according to the Texas Republic, is the Rio Grande River. That was a rather laughable claim. When Texas was a colony of Mexico, the boundary had always been the Nueces River. So the land between those two rivers, what we call the Trans-Nueces, this was Mexican soil as far as Mexico was concerned. So that when Polk decided, the new president, James K. Polk, decides to accept as legitimate the Texas claim, and he sends troops into the Trans-Nueces under Zachary Taylor, that is, for all intents and purposes, an act of war, is seen as an act of war by the Mexican government. It's often characterized, and I think fairly, that James K. Polk, bullies Mexico into a war, that this should be seen as a war of conquest. I think that's fair, but I think it's equally fair, equally accurate to say that he blunders into it as well. Because if Polk was a provincial Tennessean, was a man who could not get the feel for another culture, was clueless with regard to to Mexico's sense of grievance by the revolution itself, by the annexation of Texas, by the decision by Polk to just sort of unilaterally assume that the Trans-Nueces had now become American soil. For all of those reasons, Mexican political leaders were absolutely furious, and Polk simply did not understand that. And he certainly thought that a show of force would bring Mexican leaders to the bargaining table, and that proved to be a gross miscalculation. So does he bully Mexico into the war? Yes, but I don't think he really understood the chain of events that he had been very much involved in. When U.S. troops under Zachary Taylor crossed the Nueces River and marched to the Rio Grande, for all intents and purposes, the United States had set off a tripwire that would lead to war, which occurs in the spring, April 1846. Once the war began, there are some early victories by U.S. forces under Zachary Taylor at Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma. Polk thought after those battles were over that Mexico's refusal to negotiate would now end, and that a negotiated settlement could be reached. And he simply misunderstood the situation. Then Taylor's troops push on into northern Mexico, and at each juncture, after each American victory, and they were all American victories, Polk assumes that Mexican leaders would negotiate. And each time he realized that was simply not the case. When American troops crossed what would soon become the American Southwest and seized Santa Fe, New Mexico, and then ports on the Pacific in California, he again assumed that Mexican leaders would negotiate. And what essentially had happened was that the Mexican government was in such a state of chaos and disarray that there really wasn't anyone to negotiate with. And so the war dragged on. So I think it's absolutely clear that if someone had told James K. Polk in the spring of 1846, when the war began, that this war would drag on for a year and a half and finally end with the American invasion of southern Mexico and the fall of the Mexican capital, I think he would have been he simply would have refused to believe you. He really did think very early on, even before the war began and in its early stages, that a negotiated settlement could be reached. And each time he was mistaken.
Be sure to listen to the bonus episode where you can hear my entire interview with Sam W. Haynes and get a more complete understanding of the war. As the war raged on, the young men schemed and devised a plot to take over the Whig Party. They began by publishing scathing criticisms of Congressman Robert Winthrop, who held considerable sway in the Cotton Whig faction. In September of 1846, both factions were brought together for the Whig State Convention. Sumner gave a rousing speech against slavery, encouraging the party delegates to join the conscience side, and urged U.S. Senator Daniel Webster, a major figure in both state and national politics, to side with the young politicians. Webster spoke and urged the delegates to come together and push for solidarity. The Cotton Whigs rebuked the young conscience men and whipped the delegates into order. The delegates, confused by the intricacies, followed their leaders and rejected the Conscience Whigs' resolutions, leading to a major defeat for the anti-slavery cause in Massachusetts. Wilson had dedicated over a year to stirring dissent and trying to capture the Whig Party, but all his work had culminated in loss. Discouraged by the failure and still financially unstable, Wilson considered giving up public office. His shoe business began to pick up and began to make a considerable profit. Between 1840 to 1846, Wilson's business went from producing 38,000 shoes to 62,000. He employed around 59 men. In 1846, his production began to decline. Most drops in business wouldn't bother him too much, but this one did because his wife, Harriet, was pregnant. And on November 11, 1846, Harriet gave birth to their first and only son, Henry Hamilton. Wilson was overjoyed by his son's entrance into the world and called him a, quote, fat and hearty first-rate little fellow, end quote. A frequent theme throughout her life, Harriet became very ill following Henry's birth. But after only a few weeks, she recovered, and to quote Wilson biographer Ernest Mackay, quote, Wilson's enthusiasm rose to new heights, end quote. Wilson wanted to provide his little boy with a better childhood than he had, so he made it his mission to employ more men and make more shoes. Not long after the birth of his son, Wilson hired 100 men and produced around 122,000 shoes that year. At just 34, Wilson, with a renewed passion for life, put his political losses behind him and pressed forward on his ambitions and passions to end slavery. Thank you all for listening to this information-filled episode. We covered a lot, so as always, let me run through it. We discussed the election of 1840 and Wilson's election to the Massachusetts State House. We talked about Texas and the question of annexation and the election of 1844 and the growing divide between Cotton and Conscience Whigs in Massachusetts. We covered the Mexican-American War. We discussed Wilson and the other young Whigs' newspaper adventure and their failure at the state convention. And of course, we finished on the birth of Wilson's son and Wilson's reinvigorated passion for abolition. If you're interested in more context on the Mexican-American War, please check out the bonus episode released at the same time as this one. I appreciate Professor Haynes for taking the time to guide us through the events. If you found today's episode interesting, I encourage you to subscribe or follow so you don't miss any new episodes. And if you're interested in seeing some of Wilson's life and doing some more reading, check out HenryWilsonHistory.com, my website dedicated to information on Wilson. If you have any questions or comments you'd like to share, please email them to HenryWilsonPodcast@gmail.com, and I will do my best to respond in a future episode. I can't wait to keep discussing the life of Henry Wilson and the road to the Civil War.